The vast Pacific stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun of June 4, 1942, its surface deceptively serene. 6 months after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the waters near a tiny atoll called Midway concealed a tension that would soon erupt into one of history's most decisive naval engagements. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's ambitious plan to destroy what remained of the American Pacific Fleet was about to collide with a desperate American defense bolstered by a critical intelligence breakthrough. The enemy will appear from the northwest, with strong forces, including carriers, cruisers, and battleships. The intelligence report on Admiral Chester Nimitz's desk had been clear. For once, the Americans would not be caught by surprise. This foreknowledge would prove pivotal in what military historians would later call the battle that changed the course of the Pacific War. As dawn broke over the Central Pacific, the Japanese and American naval forces moved like chess pieces on a board spanning hundreds of miles. Neither fleet could see the other. This was naval warfare in a new age, battles fought beyond the horizon, where aircraft served as both the eyes and the striking fists of massive carrier groups. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron stood on the flight deck of the USS Hornet, the salt wind cutting through his flight jacket. He knew the mission before his Torpedo Squadron 8 would likely be their last. The outdated TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were slow, vulnerable targets against the Japanese Zero fighters. Yet these men would fly regardless, exemplifying a pivotal transition in naval warfare where sailors now fought and died miles above the ocean's surface. Traditional naval doctrine was being rewritten in real time during Midway, noted naval historian Craig Simons in his analysis, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan. For thousands of years, ships fought by positioning alongside one another and firing directly. At Midway, the opposing fleet commanders never laid eyes on each other's capital ships. The Japanese fleet approached with confidence bordering on arrogance. Their 6-month rampage across the Pacific had met little effective resistance. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same striking force that had devastated Pearl Harbor. The Japanese naval air power had proven unstoppable across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, but Admiral Nimitz had positioned his own carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, ready to ambush the Japanese force. The Americans had fewer ships, fewer planes, and less experienced pilots. What they possessed instead was the element of surprise and a new understanding of carrier warfare that would be tested under the most extreme conditions. The Japanese struck first. At precisely 4:25 that morning, the first wave of bombers lifted from Nagumo's carriers to attack Midway's defenses. The island's radar picked up the incoming raid at 5:20. Minutes later, the air was filled with anti-aircraft fire as American Marine fighters rose to meet the attack, their obsolete Brewster Buffalo and Wildcat fighters overwhelmed by the superior Japanese Zeros. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the Japanese strike force toward Midway. Through his cockpit, he could see the tiny atoll growing on the horizon. His radio man transmitted the fateful message, "There is need for a second attack wave." This simple communication would set in motion a chain of events that would upend the carefully orchestrated Japanese plan. Meanwhile, American scout planes desperately searched the vast ocean for the Japanese fleet. At 7:20, a PBY Catalina pilot radioed, "Enemy carriers sighted." The game of cat and mouse was over. Now would begin a deadly dance of attack waves, fighter interceptions, and anti-aircraft barrages that would demonstrate how naval warfare had evolved into a 3-dimensional struggle where victory depended, not just on firepower but on timing, coordination, and fateful decisions made under unimaginable pressure. The morning of June 4th continued to unfold with a terrible symmetry. While Japanese bombers pounded Midway's installations, Admiral Nagumo faced the first major tactical decision of the battle. Reports from Tominaga indicated a second strike would be necessary to neutralize the island's defenses. Simultaneously, scout planes reported American ships in the vicinity. The admiral now confronted the classic carrier commander's dilemma. Should he prepare his reserve aircraft for a second strike against Midway, or arm them for an attack on the American naval forces? Nagumo's decision-making process at this critical juncture reflected the transitional nature of naval doctrine in 1942, writes historian Jonathan Parshall in Shattered Sword, The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway. The Japanese had mastered carrier operations, but had not fully appreciated the flexibility required when faced with rapidly changing circumstances. In a fateful move that would be analyzed by naval tacticians for generations, Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft, rearmed with land attack weapons, for a second strike on Midway. The flight decks of the Japanese carriers became hives of activity as ordnance teams brought up bombs to replace the torpedoes that had been prepared for naval combat. This complex operation required time, precious time that the Japanese did not have. At 7:55, the situation changed dramatically when a scout plane reported 10 enemy torpedo planes heading toward you. Nagumo now ordered another tactical reversal. The aircraft would be rearmed again with torpedoes. Bombs were returned to the magazines while torpedo warheads were brought up. The 4 Japanese carriers, technological marvels of their age, had become temporarily vulnerable, their decks cluttered with munitions and fuel lines. Meanwhile, American attacks began to materialize. The first wave came from Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander Waldron. Flying obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, the squadron approached the Japanese fleet at barely 100 miles per hour, flying low, over the water as their tactics demanded. What followed was one of the most poignant episodes of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, consisting of Agile Zero fighters, descended upon the slow American torpedo bombers like hawks on sparrows. Without fighter escort and flying straight, level approaches required for torpedo runs, Waldron's men were decimated. Of 15 aircraft, all were shot down. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the ocean to witness the battle's later phases. The sacrifice of Torpedo 8 represents the brutal arithmetic of this new form of naval warfare, noted Pacific War correspondent Robert Casey in his 1944 account. Men who might never have seen combat in traditional ship-to-ship engagements were now dying miles from their vessels in a desperate bid to deliver their weapons. Yet this apparent disaster served a crucial tactical purpose. The Japanese fighters had been drawn down to sea level to intercept the torpedo bombers. More importantly, the defending Zeros were pulled out of position, creating gaps in the protective fighter screen above the carriers. At 10:25, events reached their crescendo. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown also launched attacks, suffering similar devastating losses. The Japanese carriers continued their evasive maneuvers, their decks still in disarray from the rearming operations. Then, at the battle's pivotal moment, 3 squadrons of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers appeared at 14,000 feet, led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey from Enterprise and Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie from Yorktown. They had arrived at precisely the moment when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, their decks crowded with aircraft, being refueled and rearmed, their fighter cover out of position. The American dive bombers pushed over into their attack. Unlike the torpedo bombers, which had to fly straight and level, dive bombers could attack from above at steep angles, making them harder to intercept. Within 6 minutes, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit multiple times by 1,000-pound bombs that penetrated their flight decks before exploding among the packed aircraft and munitions below. The transformation was absolute, recalled Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, who placed a bomb directly on Akagi's flight deck. One moment there were 3 powerful carriers launching and recovering aircraft. Minutes later, they were floating. Infernos. By early afternoon on June 4th, the tactical landscape of the Battle of Midway had transformed dramatically. 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning hulks, their flight decks shattered, their hangars transformed into infernos as aviation fuel fed the flames. Only the carrier Hiryu remained operational, its commander, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, quickly organizing a counterattack against the American forces. The speed with which naval fortunes could reverse in carrier warfare was unprecedented in military history, noted naval strategist Captain Wayne Hughes in his analysis Fleet Tactics and Naval Operations. Within hours, the balance of power in the Central Pacific had shifted fundamentally. a reality that traditional battleship admirals of both navies were slow to comprehend. At 11:05, Hiryu launched 18 dive bombers and 6 fighter escorts toward the American carriers. The Japanese pilots located the USS Yorktown and executed a well-coordinated attack. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and intercepting Wildcat fighters, 3 bombs struck the American carrier, causing severe damage to her boilers and reducing her speed. The damage control teams aboard Yorktown demonstrated another evolution in naval warfare, the increasing sophistication of shipboard damage management. Led by Lieutenant Commander J.F. Delaney, these teams fought fires, patched holes, and restored power to essential systems. Within an hour, Yorktown was capable of launching and recovering aircraft again, a remarkable achievement that reflected the evolving understanding of a carrier's vulnerabilities and the specialized skills needed to keep these complex vessels fighting.
Damage control became as crucial as gunnery in this new era of naval warfare, wrote survivor Lieutenant John Thatch in his post-war memoir. The difference between victory and defeat often came down to how quickly flooding could be contained,
or fires extinguished. At 12:40, Hiryu launched a second attack wave, this time comprising 10 torpedo bombers with 6 fighter escorts. Despite the Yorktown's restored capabilities and the combat air patrol circling protectively overhead, several torpedoes struck the American carrier. This second attack proved too much for the damaged vessel. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered the ship abandoned, though it would remain afloat until finally sinking on June 7th. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American carrier task forces from USS Enterprise, demonstrated the evolving tactical thinking required of modern naval commanders. Rather than pursuing an aggressive attack that might expose his carriers, he maintained a measured approach, calculating the risks of each movement in this deadly game of strike and counterstrike. Spruance's decisions at Midway represent a watershed in naval command thinking, military historian Samuel Eliot Morrison observed in his 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations in World War II. He recognized that preserving his carrier strike capability was more important than pursuing an enemy whose exact position remained uncertain. By the afternoon, American scout planes had located the Hiryu. Enterprise and Hornet launched a combined strike force of dive bombers that found the Japanese carrier maneuvering alone. In a repeat of the morning's devastating attacks, American bombs crashed through Hiryu's flight deck, igniting fires that would eventually consume the vessel. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship, a traditional honor that stood in stark contrast to the revolutionary battlefield on which he fought. As night fell on June 4th, the tactical picture had reversed completely. The Japanese carrier force had been virtually annihilated, while 2 American carriers remained operational. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. More significantly, they had lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific War. Throughout the night, both fleets reorganized and reassessed. The American commanders, having witnessed the devastating effectiveness of their dive bombers, began formulating new tactical doctrines that would emphasize coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The Japanese leadership, meanwhile, struggled to comprehend how their seemingly invincible naval air arm had been so thoroughly defeated. By midnight on June 4, 1942, naval warfare had been fundamentally redefined, wrote Pacific correspondent William Bradford High in The Fight for Midway. The decisive weapons were no longer the massive 16-inch guns of battleships, but the bombs and torpedoes delivered by carrier aircraft striking from beyond the horizon. Dawn on June 5th revealed a Pacific battlefield transformed, where, once the mighty Kido Butai, Japan's carrier striking force, had reigned supreme, now only scattered rescue operations and retreating support vessels remained. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the overall operation from the battleship Yamato hundreds of miles away, faced the agonizing decision to withdraw without achieving any of his objectives. The scope of Japanese defeat at Midway cannot be overstated, noted military analyst John Keegan in The Price of Admiralty. In 24 hours, Japan lost naval air superiority in the Pacific, a blow from which their maritime strategy would never recover. The American forces pursued cautiously. Admiral Spruance, still commanding from Enterprise, ordered searches for any remaining Japanese vessels, but resisted the temptation to press his advantage too aggressively. This decision would later be scrutinized by some naval historians, but reflected an important tactical reality of carrier warfare: the vulnerability of carriers when operating without sufficient reconnaissance or fighter protection. Spruance's restraint demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the carrier's paradoxical nature, wrote naval theorist Bernard Brodie in Sea Power in the Machine Age. These vessels represented tremendous offensive power, yet remained remarkably fragile when caught in unfavorable circumstances. The following days saw American submarines joining the hunt, demonstrating another evolving dimension of naval warfare. The USS Tambor and USS Trout patrolled the likely Japanese withdrawal routes, though with limited success. The coordination between submarine forces and carrier task forces remained rudimentary, showing an aspect of combined naval operations that would continue to develop throughout the war. For the sailors and airmen who had survived the maelstrom, the battle's impact wasn't immediately clear. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose dive bombers had delivered the decisive blows against Akagi and Kaga, noted in his after-action report, "We carried out our assigned mission. The results were observed." This understated assessment belied the historic significance of what these men had accomplished. As the Americans consolidated their position, the full implications of the battle began to emerge. The carrier, once considered merely a support vessel for the battleship fleet, had proven itself the decisive weapon of naval warfare. The battle had demonstrated that controlling the skies above the ocean was tantamount to controlling the ocean itself, a revolution in maritime strategy. Midway represented the moment when theoretical discussions about carrier warfare gave way to battle-proven doctrine, observed Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan scholar John Tetsuro Sumida. The theories had been tested in the crucible of combat, and the results were unequivocal. On both sides, the lessons were being absorbed and analyzed. The Americans recognized the need for better fighter protection for their torpedo bombers, and improved coordination between different attack aircraft. The successful Dauntless dive bombers would remain the backbone of American carrier striking power, while the ineffective Devastator torpedo bombers would quickly be replaced by the Superior Avenger. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy staff confronted the disaster with a mixture of disbelief and determination. They correctly identified some of the tactical failures that had led to defeat: poor reconnaissance, inadequate fighter direction, and the fatal decision to rearm aircraft on crowded flight decks. However, they failed to grasp the strategic implications of losing so many experienced pilots, a resource Japan could not readily replace. Perhaps the most significant post-Midway development was the changing nature of carrier group formations, noted former naval officer and historian Samuel Eliot Morrison in Coral Sea Midway and Submarine Actions. Both navies began to develop more sophisticated defensive screens around their carriers, with dedicated combat air patrols operating at different altitudes and radar-directed fighter interception becoming increasingly important. For Admiral Nimitz, the victory provided validation for the emerging American approach to carrier warfare. Task forces would now operate with multiple carriers supporting each other, rather than as individual units. Fighter direction officers gained prominence as the complexity of coordinating dozens of aircraft over hundreds of square miles became apparent. The human cost of this evolution in naval warfare was sobering. Of the 307 Japanese pilots who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, more than a third perished at Midway. American losses, while numerically smaller, included the near-complete annihilation of torpedo squadrons that had flown with extraordinary courage against overwhelming odds. By sunset on June 6th, as the last search planes returned to their carriers, naval warfare had entered a new era, wrote historian Walter Lord in his account, Incredible Victory. The big-gun battleship admirals would continue to resist, but the evidence was irrefutable. The carrier task force had become the arbiter of power in the Pacific. The reverberations of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical outcome. By June 8, 1942, as the last surviving Japanese vessels disappeared over the horizon, military planners on both sides of the Pacific began reassessing their strategic positions in light of this decisive engagement. Midway forced a fundamental recalculation of Japanese war planning, noted historian H.P. Wilmot in The Barrier and the Javelin. What had been conceived as a limited war of rapid conquest now faced the prospect of a prolonged struggle against an industrial power whose carrier production capacity was just beginning to accelerate. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz convened his staff to analyze the battle's lessons. The Americans had prevailed despite significant disadvantages, inexperience, and, in many categories of aircraft capability. The victory had demonstrated the critical importance of intelligence. The breaking of Japanese naval codes had provided the strategic advantage that offset Japan's tactical superiority. Commander Joseph Rochefort, whose cryptanalysis team had been instrumental in predicting the Japanese attack on Midway, received little immediate recognition for his contribution. Yet his work represented another crucial evolution in naval warfare: the growing importance of signals intelligence and its integration into operational planning. The marriage of intelligence and operations at Midway established a pattern that would characterize American naval strategy throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, wrote intelligence historian Edwin T. Layton in And I Was There. Never again would major fleet movements occur without intensive efforts to determine enemy intentions through signals interception and code breaking. The Japanese leadership, meanwhile, compounded their defeat by concealing its magnitude from the Japanese people and, to some extent, from their own military. Admiral Yamamoto recognized the strategic disaster, but found his influence diminished. The carrier admirals who might have best understood the lessons of the defeat, Nagumo, Yamaguchi, and others, were dead or disgraced. Perhaps the most significant strategic failure post-Midway was Japan's inability to adapt its naval aviation training program, observed historian Mark Peattie in Sunburst, The Rise of Japanese Naval Air Power. While America accelerated pilot training and accepted higher initial casualty rates to build experience, Japan continued to rely on a small cadre of elite aviators who could not be replaced once lost. By July, American shipyards were launching new Essex-class carriers at an accelerating pace, while Japanese carrier construction struggled to replace the losses from Midway. This industrial disparity reflected a strategic miscalculation at the heart of Japanese planning: the belief that decisive battle could force America to negotiate before its industrial might could be brought to bear. For the officers who had commanded at Midway, the battle prompted deep reflection on the nature of carrier operations. Admiral Spruance, initially a cruiser commander thrust into carrier leadership, emerged with an enhanced reputation for prudent aggression. His counterpart, Admiral Nagumo, became emblematic of the dangers of rigid thinking in the fluid environment of carrier warfare. Midway created a new generation of naval leaders who understood intuitively what previously had been theoretical: that carriers projected power through their air groups rather than through the vessels themselves, wrote naval historian Norman E. F. Friedman in U.S. Aircraft Carriers, An Illustrated Design History. The battle accelerated technological development as well. The limitations of the American torpedo bombers had been painfully exposed, leading to an urgent re-equipping program. Radar, which had played a limited role at Midway, would become increasingly central to carrier operations, allowing for more effective fighter direction and early warning. By autumn 1942, as Allied forces landed at Guadalcanal, the strategic initiative in the Pacific had clearly shifted. Japanese naval units still fought with skill and determination, but the aura of invincibility that had surrounded their carrier force since Pearl Harbor had been shattered. What Midway ultimately represented was not just a tactical victory, but a vindication of a particular approach to modern naval warfare, concluded historian Craig Simons. The Carrier Task Force, operating as an integrated weapons system with layered defenses and coordinated striking power, had proven itself the dominant maritime force of the mid-20th century. As 1942 drew to a close, both Japanese and American naval planners continued refining their approaches to carrier warfare. The Americans increasingly emphasized the task group concept, with multiple carriers operating in mutual support. The Japanese, hampered by losses they could not replace, began considering desperate measures that would eventually include the kamikaze strategy, a telling indication of how thoroughly Midway had undermined their conventional naval power. According to the Chicago Tribune's war correspondent Robert J. Casey, who interviewed returning pilots. The men who fought at Midway understood they had participated in something historic. But few realized they had witnessed the defining naval battle of the modern era, the moment when centuries of naval tradition gave way to a new paradigm of warfare fought in 3 dimensions across hundreds of miles of open ocean. In the years following the Battle of Midway, its tactical innovations rippled outward, transforming naval doctrine worldwide. By 1943, carrier task forces had become the centerpiece of American naval strategy in the Pacific, with battleships relegated to supporting roles providing anti-aircraft protection and shore bombardment. Midway crystallized concepts that had been developing since the interwar period, noted Admiral R. Lee Burke in a 1962 Naval Institute Proceedings article. The carrier air wing became understood as a unified striking force rather than separate squadrons, while combat air patrols evolved into sophisticated defensive systems integrated with radar pickets and fighter direction. The most immediate technical evolution came in aircraft design and employment. The TBD Devastator torpedo bombers that had been slaughtered at Midway were quickly replaced by TBF Avengers, which offered better speed, armor, and weapons capability. Fighter direction techniques improved dramatically, with specialized officers using radar data to vector fighters to intercept incoming raids, a capability almost entirely absent at Midway. By early 1944, American carrier operations bore little resemblance to those at Midway, wrote historian Barrett Tillman in Enterprise, America's Fightingest Ship. Multi-carrier task groups operated with coordinated air plans, combat air patrols stacked at different altitudes, dedicated anti-submarine patrols, and continuous reconnaissance, all managed through sophisticated communication networks that had barely existed 2 years earlier. The Japanese Navy, despite its devastating losses, attempted to incorporate lessons from Midway as well. Surviving officers emphasized improved fighter direction and the need for more rapid aircraft rearming procedures. However, Japan's fundamental inability to replace experienced pilots and carriers prevented them from fully implementing these lessons. The battle's most profound legacy may have been its influence on American industrial mobilization, suggested economic historian David Kennedy in Freedom from Fear. After Midway, the United States committed to a carrier construction program of unprecedented scale, authorizing dozens of Essex-class fleet carriers and light carriers that would eventually overwhelm Japanese maritime capabilities entirely. By 1945, the aircraft carrier had completely displaced the battleship as the capital ship of major navies, a transformation forecast by visionaries like Admiral William Moffett in the 1920s, but only fully realized through the crucible of Pacific combat. The Battle of Midway stood as the inflection point in this revolution. The human dimension of carrier warfare evolved as well. The specialized skills required of naval aviators, flight deck officers, radar operators, and fighter directors created new career paths and training regimens. Naval academies worldwide revised their curricula to emphasize aviation and electronic warfare alongside traditional seamanship. Perhaps Midway's most enduring tactical legacy was the validation of coordinated, multi-axis attacks against enemy carrier forces, observed Japanese naval historian Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and later studied the Midway engagement extensively. The principle that overwhelming a carrier's defenses required simultaneous threats from different directions and altitudes became fundamental to post-war naval strike doctrine. For the veterans of Midway, the battle's significance grew clearer with time. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, noted in a 1967 interview with Naval History magazine, "We didn't realize we were making history. We were just young men doing what we were trained to do, following our squadron commander into what looked like certain death, because that was our duty." The evolution of naval tactics accelerated after Midway. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for the lopsided American victory, carrier tactics had matured dramatically. Fighter direction, radar employment, and coordinated strike packages demonstrated how thoroughly the lessons of Midway had been absorbed and extended. The intellectual framework of modern naval air operations can be traced directly to the analytical work done in the aftermath of Midway, wrote Defense Department analyst Andrew Marshall in a 1982 strategic assessment. The battle provided the empirical foundation for concepts that would later incorporate missiles, nuclear weapons, and electronic warfare into carrier doctrine. The legacy of Midway extended beyond tactics into strategic thinking. The battle demonstrated conclusively that naval power in the mid-20th century depended less on controlling sea lanes through surface action than on establishing air superiority over vast maritime areas. This principle would influence Cold War naval strategy and continues to shape maritime thinking in the 21st century. According to Admiral Chester Nimitz in his final assessment of the Pacific Campaign, Midway was the most decisive single action in the history of naval warfare, not merely because of its immediate tactical outcome, which was important enough, but because it demonstrated irrefutably that the carrier, not the battleship, would dominate the seas for the foreseeable future. In historical perspective, the Battle of Midway stands as a rare example of a truly decisive engagement, one that not only determined the outcome of a campaign, but fundamentally altered the character of warfare. The tactical innovations born of necessity in those critical minutes when American dive bombers appeared over vulnerable Japanese carriers rippled outward through decades of naval development. Today's carrier battle groups, with their layered defenses, networked sensors, and integrated air wings, trace their operational concepts directly to lessons learned in those few crucial hours north of Midway Atoll. Modern naval officers still study the decisions of Spruance and Nagumo, finding in them timeless principles about combat leadership, the integration of intelligence with operations, and the delicate balance between aggression and prudence in carrier warfare. As naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison concluded in his definitive account, Midway marked not merely a tactical victory or even a strategic turning point, but the emergence of a new epoch in maritime conflict. The age of the carrier had arrived, and with it, warfare that operated simultaneously on the surface, beneath it, and far above it, presaging the multi-domain operations that would characterize conflicts into the next century. The waters north of Midway Atoll have long since closed over the sunken carriers and the remains of those who went down with them. But the revolution in naval warfare that crystallized there continues to influence maritime strategy, naval architecture, and tactical doctrine across the world's oceans, a legacy as vast as the battlefield on which it was forged.